Okay, welcome back. This is part 2 of the week 8 lecture. So now let's move on to unit 3. And again, I keep referring to this as the American Renaissance. So what does that mean? Let's think a little bit more about the term and the historical period that it's often been used to refer to. So we're kind of operating with some terminology that's been passed down to us, over the years. So back in the 1940s, really, we have sort of some early attempts to standardize the study of American literature in colleges and universities. So previously, if American college students had wanted to study literature, they probably would not have been reading American literature. They would have been reading English or French or, some other national lit. But as we get into the early 1900s, we've had enough work done, we've had enough literary production by that point to where some scholars are starting to think, hey, we really need to study our own literature, we need to study our own literary traditions and our own authors. But that doesn't really become a standard academic discipline until right around World War II, which is roughly, 100 years ago, a little less than 100 years ago. So the study of American literature is still relatively young in the grand scheme of things. But we can kind of imagine how this process played out if you think about the time period. So again, we're right around 1940. So a bunch of the critics and scholars, literature professors who sit down to really determine what American literature is and how we're going to study it. As you can probably guess, these guys were largely male, almost exclusively white. They taught largely at Ivy League institutions like Harvard and Princeton. So they sat down and basically created the first version of what we call the American literary canon, which is just a broad term referring to the collection of American texts that are most often taught, that are held up as sort of the best work produced by American writers. So the canon is not like a physical thing that you can hold, but it's kind of like a syllabus. It's like if you're thinking of American literature as a class, as a thing to be learned, here are all the texts, here are all the best texts that you need to read if you want to really understand and appreciate American literature. So these guys are creating the canon, and they identify writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, Walt Whitman, and Ralph Waldo Emerson as some of the first really important American writers. And this guy named F.O. Matheson, who's really instrumental in creating this concept, and in fact, the concept was his creation. He wrote a book called The American Renaissance. Matheson's the one who really organizes the group. He says, okay, it's Hawthorne, it's Melville, it's Whitman, it's Emerson, and then later he kind of includes Poe. Initially, Poe was kept separate from the other Renaissance figures for various reasons that we don't have to worry about. But then later Matheson does recognize that Poe is equally important, so he incorporates Poe into the group. Okay, that's fine. And that was sort of the early consensus. The idea was these are the most important American writers. And they also decided basically that nothing of real importance had been done before these guys. They acknowledged the historical importance of Washington Irving. They acknowledged the historical importance of a novel like Charlotte Temple, our first bestseller from back in the 1790s, as I've mentioned. But they didn't think those texts had a lot of artistic value, at least not compared to these other figures. They thought the American Renaissance group were sort of, they thought those guys were more complex. They tackled more difficult themes, more important themes in terms of American identity and American culture. So we actually reject a lot of that thinking nowadays. And you can see it just in my own syllabus. I mean, we started much, much earlier, and we've read Charles Bronson Brown, and we read some early sentimental fiction, and we've read these other more obscure writers who, Matheson and his crowd really didn't have a ton of interest in. They were like, yeah, they produce literature, we can acknowledge them, but when it comes to artistic value, when it comes to the stuff that really matters, that doesn't really start to come out until the 1830s. So the Renaissance is said to begin in the 1830s with figures like Hawthorne and Poe. And then it continues on through the 1840s and 1850s and really goes all the way up to the start of the American Civil War, at which point literature in this country changes in many ways. But I'm not going to tell you about that because that's Nick's territory in the second part of English 451. We stop at the Civil War. So that was the traditional conception of the American literary canon. We don't have to worry about the older stuff. Let's just start with Hawthorne and Poe, and then we'll do Melville, Whitman, Emerson, maybe some of the other transcendentalists like Thoreau, and we're good. We can kind of move on from there. But we don't have to stick to that, and we don't stick to that anymore. Like I said, now American literature scholars go much earlier in history to find some of our origins, some of our important beginnings. But also, over the years, we've tried to expand the canon, not just by going earlier, by going back to the 16 or 1700s, but also by paying more attention to what else was going on besides just the Renaissance authors and their work. So you might notice in that list I've provided of the Renaissance writers that were celebrated initially by Matheson and company, they're all men. They are all white men. Melville, Emerson, Hawthorne, Whitman, and Poe. So now we've expanded the canon to include more people of color, more women writers, and there's also this tension that is a lot more important to us now than it was to Matheson back in 1940. And it's the fact that a lot of the American Renaissance writers were not overly popular during their lifetimes. So we're going to talk more about this in the weeks to come, but some of you might already know that in regard to Hawthorne or Melville. Very well known today, very celebrated, very famous writers. They weren't wildly popular during their lifetime. In fact, Melville had some early success, but you might know that Moby Dick was not popular, not successful when it first came out in the early 1850s, and it pretty much submarined Melville's writing career. He was never popular again after Moby Dick. People were really pissed at him because of that book, so he died in obscurity. He pretty much stopped selling books altogether, although he did not stop writing. Hawthorne was a little bit more successful, but he wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a smash hit. So we appreciate a lot of what these Renaissance figures were doing. A lot of them were stylistically innovative, certainly in the case of Melville and Poe, I would argue as well. They were kind of ahead of their time. That's part of the reason they weren't always appreciated. That's certainly true with a book like Moby Dick, if you guys have ever read that. I mean, it's a difficult novel to get through, but it wasn't popular when it came out because it was so unlike what most novels were back then. Nowadays, we regard it as kind of a modern, or like a postmodern novel that anticipates a lot of future developments in literature, not just American literature, but the entire sort of English language tradition. It anticipates a lot of stuff that would happen later in the 20th century. So that is sometimes the reason why certain artists are appreciated more after they die. Because they might have been innovative and ahead of their time, and audiences during their own time maybe weren't quite ready for some of these new sort of inventions, some of these new experiments. So that is true. But we do have to acknowledge that these writers, most of these Renaissance figures, were not super popular during their era. And what was popular, as I've already mentioned, was the sentimental novel genre. So it was popular back in the 1790s, and it continues to be popular throughout the first half of the 1800s. So you might remember when I first mentioned Charlotte Temple as our first American bestseller, written by Susanna Rowson back in the early 1790s, I mentioned that it remained the best-selling American novel until the 1850s and the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, another sentimental novel written, in this case, by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Very important novel just in terms of our history. It had sort of an impact on the brewing conflict that would later be known as the Civil War, because it was obviously an abolitionist sort of look at slavery and conditions in the South, written by a woman from New England who was advocating for social change, but she was also operating within that familiar sentimental novel style that remained very popular. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. We need to understand that while the American Renaissance writers were active and, producing the literature that we still read today, there was a lot more popular fiction that's largely forgotten today. A lot of the sentimental novels that were dominating the marketplace in the 1840s and the 1850s, we don't really read them anymore. In some cases, we might talk about them, we might mention them, but they don't get taught as much. They're not, anthologized nearly as much. And some of that has to do with that initial exclusion practiced by Matheson and those other scholars back in the 1940s when they were first creating the American literary canon. They excluded black writers, they excluded women, by and large. Now, you could argue that they did sort of include Emily Dickinson in a sort of, as they, moved up to a later era, but they overlooked most of the sentimental writers. And as I've pointed out, a lot of the popular sentimental novels of the 19th century were written by women. Not exclusively, but many of them were written by women, and many of the protagonists of those novels were women. So I think it's fair to argue that there was some misogyny involved in the initial decision-making process. When Matheson and those guys were making the canon, they looked at sentimental novels as, sure, popular, but not artistically valuable. That was their evaluation. How much of that was based on their, prejudice towards women artists? I can't say for sure, but based on the time period, I would say that's at least a factor. That's at least a part of it. But we're trying to rectify that today as we expand the canon. We're trying to have a better appreciation, not just for these Renaissance figures who have been celebrated, again, for nearly a century now, but also for some of their contemporaries, some of the sentimental novel writers like Eden Southward, like Fanny Fern, like Maria Cummins, who we're actually going to read a little bit from one of her novels in a few weeks, like Harriet Beecher Stowe. These authors who actually sold a lot of books and in many cases made more money than writers like Hawthorne and Melville because they were more popular. Their books were more successful, in terms of economics, but also just in terms of finding a broad readership. So there's this argument, and I think it's still going on today, between what might be considered like high art, or what we sometimes refer to as high literature, or literature with a capital L, versus what's often referred to as popular literature. Now, many critics and scholars will argue that this is a very arbitrary distinction, and there's really no meaningful separation between high art and popular art. They can be one and the same. They can, the lines are very blurry. Some people argue that, and I think there's some truth to that. But traditionally, if we're just sort of looking at the way these categories would have been thought about in previous historical eras, there was a distinction. And it was pretty significant, right? High art was really only accessible to really well-educated, fairly affluent people. It wasn't really intended for the masses, right? And we still have forms of high art today that a lot of people don't really experience very much, like the opera or ballet, or going to listen to a symphony, classical music. Plenty of people like that stuff, but it's not as popular as popular music. It's not, people go to the movies a lot more than they go to the opera, right? People go to a rock or a hip hop concert a lot more often than they go to a ballet performance or a symphonic, an orchestral performance, right? So we often notice these basic differences. High art is kind of associated with more elite strands of culture sometimes, whereas more popular art, well, that can be enjoyed by anyone, right? It's more accessible, it's easier to find, it's cheaper to buy a ticket or to go to a movie or whatever. So we do still kind of maintain these distinctions to an extent. I would argue that they're less important now than they were back in the 1800s. But we can also make distinctions just within literature, right? Between high literature and popular literature. So if we think of popular literature as being the stuff that sells, right? Best-selling novels, James Patterson, Stephen King, J.K. Rowling, these are best-selling authors. They're creating popular fiction. And then we can contrast that with what might be thought of as literary fiction, or again, high lit, which is often thought of as being more the province of college professors, people with degrees in English, people who might work within the field, but it's not as commonly enjoyed by regular people. So you guys can form your own opinions. I still think some of those distinctions matter, at least when it comes to how we categorize things and how we sort of think about things. But certainly in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, a lot of these distinctions were very important to scholars and critics. So those early scholars putting together the American canon, they would have made a clear distinction between popular fiction, which was just entertaining, not deep, not profound, not really worthy of further study in their eyes, versus the stuff like what we're about to experience in the next few weeks, which was maybe too innovative, too difficult, too weird for the audiences of the mid-19th century, but we can appreciate it now because we see how forward-thinking it was. We see how these writers were engaged in big questions about American identity and, what it means to be an American. But those sentimental novels often treated those same thematic material, right? Just in a different style, often appealing to different readers. So we kind of have to navigate all of this, or at least just be aware of it. That sentimental novels, similar to the Coquette, similar to what we talked about back in the 1790s, continued to be very popular, as did frontier romances, stories that were full of action and adventure, often drawing on history, but incorporating some elements of those old-time romances, some fantastical events, elements of like the sort of chivalric romance, journeys, death-defying escapes. Those were popular, right? Gothic romances were popular. And then we have the American Renaissance figures who borrow from some of those genres, no doubt. But they're also doing some new stuff, and yeah, we do appreciate it more now. But are they necessarily more important than those popular writers of sentimental fiction, the pop fiction, crowd? Do we necessarily need to prioritize or privilege one over the other? That's a question we can ask. And certainly throughout the history of American literary study, like I'm saying, we have privileged the Renaissance figures over figures like Fanny Fern. Stowe gets read a fair amount, but Maria Cummins, who wrote a very popular sentimental novel named The Lamplighter, we're going to be reading a chapter of that novel in a couple of weeks. So I would like us to get a better glance at popular fiction during this era. So once we get started on the Renaissance, we're going to spend a couple of weeks on traditional Renaissance figures, like I said, starting with Hawthorne, and then next week we do Poe in honor of Halloween. It seemed appropriate. But then in week 10, I want to take a break from the Renaissance, and I want us to look at popular fiction during the 1840s and 1850s. So we're going to read a chapter from The Lamplighter, a popular sentimental novel. We're going to look at some popular humor writing of that period. We're going to read some Lydia Maria Child, who was a contemporary of Sedgwick, but continued to write up through the 1840s and 50s. She was a very influential early American journalist. So she didn't just write fiction. We're actually going to read some of her journalistic writing. Nonfiction, but it's still a good indicator of sort of her role in the larger American writing world and why she's important. So we're going to check out some more popular stuff in week 10, just to get a sense of it, just to get sort of a flavor of what was actually really selling and really successful during that time period. And then we'll get back into the Renaissance. In week 11, we'll spend time on Melville. We'll devote that entire week to Melville. And then in week 12, we read Walt Whitman, and we spend a little bit of time on Emerson. I'm not a big transcendentalist guy, but we will do a little bit on Emerson and the larger transcendental sort of movement that was also very important during this time. So that's what we're doing in the upcoming week. So again, plenty of time to get caught up because we're not tackling any novels for the next several weeks. But I would like you to be more or less on schedule again by week 11 because Melville is challenging, and we are going to read Benito Cereno, which is maybe a novella or maybe just a really long short story, much like Dolph Heiliger from Washington Irving. So that's going to take some time, and I want you to read a few other short pieces by Melville. But this week, next week with Poe, and then week 10 with just a few selections from popular fiction, you're not going to have overly heavy reading loads, at least not until week 11 when we get to Melville. So, okay. So, again, let's get back to the term and what it really means. So, Matheson and his colleagues back in the 40s were saying, okay, they're obviously borrowing the expression, the term Renaissance from the earlier Italian Renaissance, which then kind of became a larger European Renaissance, really kind of beginning in the 1500s and progressing up through the 1600s. And again, that's one of these important factors that's pushing the world closer to modernity, right? That's one of those things we've mentioned. So they're taking that idea and applying it to American culture and American literature more specifically. But just in a general sense, a Renaissance is a flourishing. It's an explosion of artistic and intellectual production. New things are being done, sort of innovations, but also just a greater appreciation for art. It's kind of implied along with that. So in the context of what we're looking at, Matheson and those guys defined this era as the first real flourishing of American literature. By the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, we finally started to produce really substantive works of literature. That's the official version that we get from Matheson and those older scholars, right? So we get these sort of landmark works like Moby Dick by Melville, like The Scarlet Letter by Hawthorne. We get Poe and Hawthorne really popularizing the short story as a literary form. As I mentioned, we have Whitman coming along with some really innovative poetry that's very interested in the American character, in the American experience. We have Emerson and the Transcendentalists. Again, not just literature. That's a philosophical school. So they're producing all kinds of writing. This is a period of intellectual growth. This is a period of artistic sort of explosion. We are sort of hitting our stride as a culture. We finally have some things to say. We have some really talented artists. We've finally been able to sort of cultivate enough of a literary culture to where we can nurture our artists. They don't have to, like Irving did, go over to England and pursue a writing career abroad. So a lot of what they identified are real historical developments that were taking place over the course of the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. Yeah, we have a bigger local native readership. We have a more robust publishing industry in America. We do have some more literary periodicals like the ones that Brown was trying to get going decades earlier. So we have more opportunities for writers to publish. Things are changing and modernizing, and it's becoming more possible for people to make their living as writers. So remember, we said Brown was kind of the first one maybe to do that, at least in our history, the first truly professional writer in American history. Irving, if you don't want to bestow that title on Brown, you can definitely argue that Irving was one of our first professional writers and certainly one of our first successful professional writers, although he did serve in a diplomatic role later. He did have another job. But then after Irving, Hawthorne also had a day job. Melville had to find regular work. But figures like Poe and Whitman and others that came after them were, increasingly able to make their living as writers. Also as editors. They were often running papers and magazines too, but they were putting out fiction. They were publishing other people's work, and that was increasingly becoming a viable career path as we climb up towards the middle of the 19th century. And again, that's a pretty major development. So Hawthorne's right in the middle of all of this, and Hawthorne's also a great representative of this tension that I'm talking about between literary fiction and popular fiction. You might have heard the famous quote from Hawthorne. It was actually in a letter that he was writing to a friend, but he's commenting directly about sentimental novels and the largely women authors who wrote them. And he's basically lamenting his own lack of success as a writer. At one point he says, I would be a lot more popular, or my work would be a lot more popular if it wasn't for that damned horde of scribbling women. And that very dismissive, derogatory phrase is used to really refer to those writers of sentimental fiction that we've been talking about. And again, as we know, that's a very broad genre. They weren't all seduction novels, but they were typically novels designed to really tap into our emotions, often featuring female protagonists overcoming various obstacles on their way towards love, happiness, and fulfillment. So you can see the dismissive attitude that Hawthorne had towards that kind of writing, that kind of literature. And that dismissive attitude was largely shared by Matheson and the American scholars who would come along later to help codify and standardize what American literature would be. So again, we might want to reject that line of thinking. But once you read a little bit of Maria Cummins, who was definitely one of the authors he was referring to in that quote, you can sort of decide, okay, well, who do you like better? Maybe you prefer Cummins' style. Maybe you like Hawthorne's style better. But again, we don't always have to get caught up in value judgments. We should just understand that there are these different trends, different kinds of literature being produced at the same time. And it just so happens that the popular kind got buried later. The less popular kind got lionized and sort of entrenched as what we need to study and what we need to know. So I just want you guys to understand that, and we can comment as we learn more. So Hawthorne is, again, this representative of somebody who we appreciate more now than maybe we did during his lifetime. He's known as a very innovative practitioner of the short story form, but he also wrote novels. Of course, I mentioned The Scarlet Letter, The Blithedale Romance, The House of the Seven Gables. And I've mentioned this also about Hawthorne. He referred to a lot of his novels as romances, like the Blithedale Romance, because he was still making a distinction between realistic novels, which were often kind of thought of more like sentimental novels, versus what he called romances. And he was still using that kind of old sense of the word, like medieval chivalric romances that featured, fantastical events, maybe a little bit of the supernatural, and some of those types of elements. So Hawthorne even talks about it very explicitly in some of his the forewords to some of his novels. He'll say, hey, if I'm writing a romance, you have to give me a little bit more leeway. You have to give me a little bit more liberty. I can make up some stuff. There's maybe going to be a ghost or something unexplained, and that's fine in a romance. You wouldn't expect it in a realistic novel, but I'm writing a romance. Like I said, nowadays, we've collapsed that distinction, and we refer to all of those as novels. But he was an important tastemaker. He was a critic. He reviewed other people's work in addition to writing his own stuff. He knew other important writers of the era. He was friends with Melville. They maintained a very long personal correspondence over a period of years. So he was an important figure, not just, as a writer, but he was just part of this larger, growing literary scene that often gets sort of characterized as the American Renaissance. So the only story of his that I want to really cover here in lecture is My Kinsman Major Molyneux. Like I said, I posted a couple of other short stories by Hawthorne that are well known. A lot of you have probably read Young Goodman Brown before. It's often anthologized. It's often taught to high schoolers. And My Kinsman Major Molyneux also used to be taught in a lot of high schools. I can remember first reading it in high school and having absolutely no idea of what was going on. I lost interest very quickly. I think Hawthorne's a tough sell for high schoolers. I also remember having to read The Scarlet Letter, and that was very painful at that age. I later came to appreciate him a little bit more in college, but I didn't revisit My Kinsman until I was in graduate school. And luckily, I had a really good professor who helped explain the story to me and helped me to finally sort of appreciate it and understand it. So if you're paying close attention to this particular short story, you'll notice that it's a really subtle, wonderfully told, funny, and very rich text. And it really does require multiple readings. We tend to miss a lot on our initial read through. That's true of almost any text, but it's certainly true of this one. There's a lot of sly irony at work in this story. Again, I completely missed the comedy. I completely missed the humor when I first read this. But part of the reason, again, Hawthorne is celebrated today is because he tends to tell rather complex stories. And he's very interested in moral ambiguity. And that's on display here. He had a little bit of personal experience with that. He was a descendant of Puritan settlers in New England. He was from Massachusetts. I think he's actually from Salem, Massachusetts. So he had like a great grandfather who was involved in the Salem witch trials, who was actually one of the judges who condemned some of those witches to death. So he kind of has this troubled, very complicated personal history that he often explored. Now, he himself largely repudiated, his ancestors' beliefs, and a lot of the descendants of those old Puritans would later become Unitarians or Congregationalists by the 1800s, which were denominations known as being pretty progressive compared to some other Protestant denominations. partly maybe in response to some of the harshness of their Puritan forebears. But a lot of Unitarians and Congregationalists were abolitionists, like Harriet Beecher Stowe. A lot of abolitionists who were sort of advocating for a lot of social change were based in New England. So there was kind of a civic spirit that developed among those populations, but there was also this kind of dark, troubling history that they could also, sort of track. And Hawthorne was very interested in sort of exploring that legacy or that history that he was a sort of a personal participant in. So, like Irving, he's also very interested in the sort of friction between rural life and urban life, but he's also very interested in the loss of faith and disillusionment. People coming to realize that a lot of their ideals, a lot of their beliefs are perhaps founded on falsehoods or perhaps not what they previously thought that they were. But he's also got a lot of other preoccupations, a lot of other motifs, and many of them are on display here with my kinsman. So it's a really good sort of introduction to Hawthorne. It's kind of a good gateway to a lot of Hawthorne's short fiction, because a lot of these preoccupations and recurring themes can be found in a lot of his other work. So, and also a fixation between the real world and sort of an otherworldly dream world. So again, that's where some of these notions of the romance show up. That's kind of what he means. And a lot of his fiction, he's exploring the sort of blurry line that sometimes separates reality from dreams, our perceptions, and how they might be affected by fantasy, or what might be thought of as like the otherworldly. So that's on display in this story as well. And our protagonist, Robin, in many ways is kind of a classic hero, especially if we think of him as kind of going on a quest or a journey. He's sort of a typical young, sort of virtuous hero. At least that's the way he's presented initially. He's presented as kind of endearing, well-meaning, maybe a little bit naive, but important to note that he is from the country and he is visiting the big city. So in many ways, this is a narrative that has been told quite often throughout American history. Again, it's kind of a central story that really taps into a lot of important characteristics or interests held by Americans, right? This idea of rural life running up against urban life. So Robin, as he's presented to us, he's a youth of barely 18 years, evidently country bred, and now, as it should seem, upon his first visit to town. So even though our narrator never really gets specific about exactly where we are, it's safe to say that this is Boston, probably in the early to mid 18th century. Because again, Hawthorne, like all of these other writers we've been looking at lately, he's setting the action in a previous historical era. So he wrote this story in the 1830s, but he's taking us back to an earlier period. Again, we're going back to a period of colonial history. We're going back to before the Revolution. So this is probably Boston as it was circa 1730 or 1740. And Robin is going there to seek out his kinsman, I believe his uncle, Major Molyneux, who's going to sort of help him get ahead in the world. He's sort of seeking his fortune. He's a grown man now, so he's leaving his parents' home and he's looking to make his way in the world. So I want you to notice this, because this is kind of characteristic of an older period of human history, relying on like family connections. And again, this is something you would have seen in a lot of English fiction from previous decades and centuries, right? The idea of, a country youth who isn't coming into any money. Maybe he's not the eldest son or whatever, so he's not going to inherit the farm. He's not going to inherit the family property, if there even is anything to inherit. So he has to go and make his way. He has to seek out his fortune, but oftentimes you would use a family connection. And this isn't totally untrue of the modern world, but he's seeking his kinsman who has some position of prominence, or so it would seem. He's supposed to be, at least in Robin's mind, his kinsman is an important person in Boston. So the idea is, I'm going to get ahead through this family connection. My relative is going to help me to, find employment, find a place to live, perhaps, and sort of seek what's next. So again, that's kind of an old world thing. That's kind of an old world tradition that's still very operative in the colonial, in our colonial past. But again, our narrator wants us to understand that Robin is not really accustomed to urban life. He doesn't know what he's getting into. He's never been to Boston before. So he doesn't understand urban life. He doesn't understand the way cities work. So a lot of the comedy in this story, a lot of the action really, is fueled by misunderstanding. Robin's inability to accurately comprehend what's going on around him. Now, eventually, he figures some things out. He figures out that Major Molyneux is not exactly a beloved citizen of Boston. He begins to understand a little bit more about his surroundings, and we can argue that he becomes kind of wise and kind of a little bit more with it by the end of the narrative. But notice that he's often referred to as shrewd throughout the narrative. He's often referred to as a shrewd youth. And of course, to be shrewd means that you're kind of smart, maybe a little bit cunning. You have, strong powers of discernment. You can understand things. And initially, that's meant with irony. Because when we first meet Robin, he's really not very shrewd. He doesn't understand things. He misunderstands things. But as the narrative progresses, we do notice that he begins to understand. He begins to comprehend things. And again, there's this whole motif of like light and darkness. There's this whole thing about illumination that kind of develops throughout the narrative, and it becomes especially important near the end when he finally finds his kinsman, when he finally sees his relative who has been tarred and feathered and is being led through the streets of Boston and laughed at, humiliated. Light plays a really important role, especially there, but also throughout the narrative. So there's these recurring sort of appearances of light and shadow. And we also just have to remember with the time period, right? This is pre-electricity, right? So he's in the city at night. The entire narrative really takes place in one single night. So it's dark, okay? So there's this idea of concealment, mystery, things hidden in the shadows. And then as Robin becomes more shrewd, as he understands more, he's able to see things illuminated. There's more light, there's more clarity as he begins to learn and as he realizes the truth about his kinsman. So yes, a lot of misunderstandings, and they serve a lot of different functions. Right? Lots of different misadventures and sort of comical episodes. So yes, they are funny on sort of a surface level, but also they are revealing very important things about the setting, about this particular colonial city that's not very big yet, but it does constitute an urban space in this largely agrarian colonial time and place. So again, this is pretty early in our colonial history, but we already have some fledgling cities that offer a very different way of life from the more agrarian, pastoral life that we see in Sleepy Hollow. We see it in Edgar Huntley a little bit, and we're seeing it at least reflected here in Robin, because Robin is sort of a bumpkin. He is from the country. That's not a negative thing in certain instances, but it kind of becomes a drawback for him here because it makes him kind of unprepared for the city. And also, all of these misadventures and misunderstandings give Hawthorne a chance to kind of riff on some of his favorite ideas, like the tension between rural and urban, the tension between reality and dreams, but also a sort of fixation on the loss of faith and disillusionment, because ultimately Robin does become sort of disillusioned, or at least he's disabused of his naive beliefs in his kinsmen and his beliefs in sort of the way the world works. Because we notice when he first arrives in the city, he sort of assumes that the importance of his kinsman is really all he needs. If he just drops his kinsman's name, he thinks that the local townspeople are going to help him. They're going to be very warm and welcoming towards him, and that's not the case. So again, Hawthorne gets a lot of comedic value out of that. So we have all of these different episodes, beginning when he goes to the barbershop, right? And he goes and tries to ask somebody a question. He grabs onto the guy's coat, and the guy tells him to, let go my garment, fellow. And right off the bat, he's met with hostility. And Robin doesn't understand it, because in his mind, his uncle's a very important person, very well respected. They know I'm related to him, so they should treat me with respect as well. And I want you to notice that throughout his journey, Robin is carrying what's described as an oak cudgel. So it's like a weapon. I think it's like a stick with kind of a rounded into it, designed to hit people, and it's used as a weapon potentially for self-defense. That's kind of how it's framed for Robin. Okay, yeah, I guess if you go to a big city, you probably want some form of protection, at least maybe a whistle or some mace or something. So he has it for protection, but notice that he's frequently tempted to use it. He's tempted to use it later when he goes to the inn, like a sort of a primitive version of a hotel, where there's also kind of a bar or a tavern on the first floor. And again, sort of a similar thing plays out. He doesn't have money, but he's asking about the major, and he gets sort of a hostile, in this case, sort of a mocking response from the innkeeper. Because if you don't have money, you can't get a room, you can't really get very far in the city. So they're laughing at Robin, right? He's a country bumpkin in the eyes of these townspeople. He doesn't know anything. He's acting in a way that they find ridiculous. But do notice that in the end, Robin is sort of tempted to beat that guy with his oak cudgel, because, that might be how you settle a lot of your differences back in that rural area. Not to say that violence wasn't prevalent in cities as well, but again, we begin to realize that Robin does have a little bit of a violent streak, perhaps. He's a little bit entitled, maybe. So we might even become disillusioned with him as the narrative continues. Maybe he's not quite what we thought he was when he was first presented to us. But we also just might look at him as a bewildered young man who's not really equipped to deal with these present surroundings. And then later, he kind of ends up in the bad part of town. He ends up at what appears to be a brothel. He's asking for his uncle. A woman answers the door, tries to get him to come inside. That's a very ambiguous scene. He might realize what's going on eventually. He seems a little confused at first because she says, "Oh yeah, Major Molyneux's here. Come on in. I'll show you to him." And I think eventually Robin starts to catch on that she's not telling him the truth. But again, there's this constant sort of search for the truth. He can't quite apprehend it. It's hidden, almost in the shadows, metaphorically speaking. But at times, things really are hidden in the shadows. So again, the literal and the metaphorical sort of blend. There really is like literal darkness that he's contending with. But there's also this sort of figurative darkness that represents his ignorance and his lack of knowledge about how urban life works. There's also a lot of things that are happening that are based on real history that might have, again, kind of gone over Robin's head. So he eventually comes into contact with a representative of some secret society. And they're like dressing up as Native Americans. They have these sort of complicated like gestures and like passwords and all of this stuff. And a lot of that's based on fact and history. And Hawthorne's drawing on, once again, the unique history of colonial New England. So it's based kind of, this secret society that's portrayed in the text is based very loosely on the real life Sons of Liberty, who really were a secret society in Boston during the late colonial period, and they were responsible for a lot of sort of anti-British, activities. They were sort of organizing, protesting certain things like the Stamp Act. So they were organizing, they were writing pamphlets and organizing protests, and in other cases, maybe even trying to undermine the local colonial governments. Which again, they had, British representatives coming over here and running these local colonies, and that gave rise to a big complaint on the part of the colonists. We didn't feel like we had true representation, so we said no taxation without representation. So a lot of what Hawthorne's drawing on was actually taking place probably more like in the 1750s and 1760s, when there was a lot of open opposition to British rule. And some colonial governors sent over by the British Crown really were kind of chased out of office or tarred and feathered or tormented or undermined in other ways by these secret societies of colonists who wanted to break free from British rule. So again, a lot of that's happening as well. And what Robin doesn't realize is Major Molyneux represents the Crown's government. He's a representative of the Crown, even though he's probably a native-born Massachusetts guy, but he represents the empire. He represents the British Crown. So he's not very popular, needless to say, amongst this secret society or a lot of the other citizens of Boston who are shown to be in opposition to colonial rule. So, again, there's this long legacy, as our narrator points out in the story, there's a long legacy of these representatives of the Crown being treated rather rudely in a lot of colonies, particularly in New England. So that's real history that he's drawing on, and that's a big part of what Robin fails to understand, right? He fails to understand his uncle's relationship to a lot of the town and how it's kind of a combative relationship, not what he expects when he first arrives. So, yeah, the tension and mystery kind of build throughout the narrative as Robin grows increasingly desperate and angry. And then later he takes refuge outside of a church after he leaves the brothel, I think. And he kind of has this long reflection. He kind of has this strange dream-like. He enters into this almost dream-like state, experiences kind of a reverie. And again, there's kind of a dream-like quality to the entire narrative. So that's also important to notice. It feels a little bit like a dream. Hawthorne likes to explore, again, that line between reality and fantasy, real life and the dream world, and how they can sometimes bleed into one another. So yeah, eventually the truth about his kinsman is revealed. So notice that scene. Notice the motif of light, the many references to the moon and moonbeams, and also shadows and darkness. Many critics argue that by the end of the story, Robin, things kind of end on a happy note for Robin because he's finally learned some things. He's finally overcome his initial naivete and sort of, misapprehensions. He's able to arrive at a more accurate understanding. But he kind of has to do that at the expense of his uncle. And that, by the way that's interpreted by many, is that he's able to sort of cast off these old familial bonds that would have been so important in the old world, right? He's able to break free from the family connections that he was initially reliant upon. And that represents, or that sort of symbolizes, a larger break from older traditions. From older customs, right? He's becoming a more modern American because he's learning and he's developing and he's changing as a result of his experiences in the city. So notice that, after he sort of sees his uncle, being paraded through town, he initially wants to return to his country home. But this new friend that he's made, who's kind of helping him to maybe arrive at a better understanding, his new friend encourages him to stay in the city. And as he says, if you prefer to remain with us town folk here in Boston, perhaps as you are a shrewd youth, you may rise in the world without the help of your kinsman. And see, that's really important because, again, that symbolizes kind of this move towards a more modern version of America. Again, self-making, remaking. You can do something with your life. You can find a new life in the city without your family, especially if your family has some troubling connections to the British Crown. You can break free from those old traditions, that sort of those old world traditions, and embrace what we might think of as more of like a meritocracy, right? Where everybody just gets ahead based on their own talent, based on their own ambition. It doesn't have to be based on your family. It doesn't have to be based on your lineage like it would have been in older cultures back in the old world. So I think we're supposed to see that juxtaposition. And now Robin might start to participate in a more modern, democratic version of America. No more colonies. No more representatives of the crown like Major Molyneux. Or he's at the very least a sympathizer. He's at the very least a supporter of the crown. No more of that. Now we're going to have bustling centers of trade, urban growth, right? And even the political uprising that we can kind of observe. Again, that's the origins of the revolution, right? That's a lot of the agitation and the anger and the organizing that would later give rise to an armed rebellion that gave us our freedom. So Robin sort of leaving that old way of doing things, represented by his old home out in the country. And at one point, we're even told that there was like a wizard that lived out there. Like his rural environment is made to seem almost fantastical, almost like mythological. The place where he comes from, the New England woods, that old rural environment. That's old. That's sort of shrouded in darkness. And now he's entering the city. Things are getting illuminated. And maybe he's joining this modern current of American life that Ichabod also seemed to be joining, right? We can see that in a lot of these works from the 1820s, 1830s. The rapid changes in America were often showing up in literature. Okay, so that's probably good for Hawthorne. I hope you enjoy that story, and if you have time, check out Roger Malvin and Young Goodman Brown, but only if you have time. Again, the only required text for Hawthorne is My Kinsman Major Molyneux, and then make sure to read Sleepy Hollow for Irving, and then we'll be ready to move on next week to Poe. So I will see you then, and we get spooky in honor of Halloween.